In 334 BCE, a 22-year-old Macedonian king crossed the Hellespont with an army a fraction the size of the forces Persia could theoretically muster, and did something no invader in nearly 2 centuries had managed. He refused to stop. Not after winning at the Granicus. Not after winning at Issus, where he captured Darius III's own family. Not even after the Persian king offered him half the empire and a fortune in gold simply to go home. Alexander wanted all of it, and he understood something about Persia that Greek strategists a century earlier had not. The empire's greatest strength, its size, its depth, its capacity to absorb defeat, could become a fatal weakness if an enemy targeted its center of gravity directly, refused to be bought off, and moved faster than Persian institutions could reorganize around each new disaster. This is the final piece of the puzzle. An empire nearly impossible to defeat by attrition finally met an opponent who understood that the only way to kill it was to aim straight for its heart and never slow down. Every weakness the empire had learned to survive, internal fracture, peripheral defeat, overextension, was about to be tested simultaneously by a single opponent for the first time in Persian history. A king who attacked not the edges of the empire, but its very center. By 336 BCE, when Darius III ascended the Achaemenid throne amid the same kind of court intrigue that had characterized the previous several successions, the Persian Empire remained, by almost any objective measure, the wealthiest and most territorially vast state in the world. It stretched from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the Indus Valley, encompassed Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, and portions of Central Asia, and could theoretically call upon resources and manpower that dwarfed anything available to the fractious city-states and semi-barbarian kingdom to its northwest. And yet, within 13 years, it would cease to exist as an independent political entity. Understanding why requires recognizing that the empire's traditional defenses, depth, patience, diplomacy, and administrative resilience, depended on assumptions that Alexander's approach to warfare systematically violated one by one. The first assumption Persia had always relied upon was that invaders needed time to consolidate gains, giving the empire's vast resources time to reorganize a response. Alexander refused to grant that time. After crossing into Anatolia in 334 BCE, he won his first major engagement at the Granicus River against a coalition of local satraps and Greek mercenaries serving Persia. But rather than pausing to fully secure Anatolia through negotiation, the traditional Persian method that Persia itself had used successfully for 2 centuries when absorbing new territory, Alexander kept moving, methodically besieging or negotiating the surrender of coastal cities to deny the still powerful Persian navy safe harbors, while continuing his advance largely without the extended pauses that had traditionally given Persian central authority time to mobilize its true strength. The massive levy armies drawn from the empire's Iranian, Mesopotamian, and Eastern satrapies. The second confrontation came at Issus in 333 BCE, where Darius III personally commanded a large Persian force, having chosen, controversially, according to some ancient accounts, a battlefield location in a narrow coastal plain that neutralized the numerical advantage his forces theoretically held, cramming his troops in a way that echoed, ironically, the same tactical trap that had doomed the Persian fleet at Salamis a century and a half earlier. Alexander's combined arms tactics, integrating heavy Macedonian phalanx infantry with companion cavalry in coordinated shock assaults, broke through Persian lines, and Darius fled the field, reportedly abandoning his chariot, his royal cloak, and critically, members of his own family, including his mother, wife, and children, who were captured by Alexander's forces. This is a pivotal psychological moment. For the first time in Achaemenid history, a reigning king of kings had personally fled a battlefield in a manner so undignified that it damaged not just military morale but the sacred aura of divinely sanctioned kingship that had underpinned Persian royal legitimacy since Cyrus. Darius, still commanding vast and used resources across the empire's eastern and southern territories, attempted the traditional Persian response: negotiation from a position of continued strength. Ancient sources describe him offering Alexander a substantial ransom for his captured family, a large territorial cession west of the Euphrates, and a marriage alliance with his daughter, terms that, had Alexander accepted them, would have replicated almost exactly the kind of negotiated settlement that had ended most previous Persian conflicts with regional powers. Alexander's reported refusal, along with his general Parmenian's famous comment that he would accept such terms if I were Alexander, and Alexander's equally famous retort that he would too if I were Parmenian, marks the precise moment where Persian strategic logic broke down entirely. The empire's historical playbook assumed rational opponents motivated by territory, wealth, and stable settlement. Alexander was pursuing something the Achaemenid system had no institutional mechanism to accommodate: total conquest and personal legitimation as successor to the Persian throne itself, not negotiated coexistence with it. While Alexander besieged Tyre and moved through the Levant and Egypt over the following 2 years, securing the empire's wealthy Mediterranean provinces and, notably, being welcomed in Egypt in a manner echoing how Cyrus himself had once been welcomed as a liberator in Babylon, this time against Persian rule rather than on its behalf, Darius III attempted to raise the largest and most comprehensive levy army the empire had assembled during the entire conflict. This force, gathered near Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia in 331 BCE, represented an attempt to use the empire's traditional strength, its capacity to draw upon the manpower of dozens of subject nations, deploying scythe chariots, war elephants from eastern satrapies, and cavalry contingents from across the Iranian plateau and Central Asia on a battlefield Darius had specifically leveled and prepared in advance, this time refusing to repeat the tactical error of Issus's constricted terrain. Gaugamela was, in a real sense, the empire fielding everything the system had been designed to produce over 2 centuries: overwhelming numbers, diverse specialized units, careful battlefield preparation, and a king personally present to rally troops from across an entire continent's worth of cultures and languages. And it still lost, decisively, to Alexander's combination of disciplined infantry, coordinated cavalry shock tactics targeting the seam in Persian lines near Darius's own position, and, crucially, battlefield leadership fast enough to exploit chaos before Persian numerical advantage could be brought fully to bear. Darius fled the field a second time, an act that, following his flight at Issus, effectively ended his political viability as king of kings regardless of what forces remained loyal to him elsewhere in the empire. Historians studying command legitimacy in ancient monarchies note that a ruler's personal battlefield conduct carried enormous symbolic weight in Achaemenid political culture. 2 flights from the field in 3 years shattered Darius's authority in a way that transcended the purely military dimension of these defeats. This is the essential insight of Part 3. Alexander did not defeat the Persian Empire through superior numbers. He was consistently outnumbered, sometimes dramatically so, at Issus and Gaugamela alike, though the precise ratios reported by ancient sources are almost certainly exaggerated in his favor. He defeated it by attacking the 2 things the empire's traditional resilience had never needed to defend against simultaneously: the personal legitimacy of the reigning king, and the amount of time available for the empire's vast provincial machinery to reorganize around a crisis at its absolute center rather than its periphery. Every previous challenge Persia had survived: Ionian revolt, Egyptian rebellion, Greek invasion, satrapal uprising, had occurred at the empire's edges, leaving the core administrative and military apparatus in Persia proper untouched and able to respond at its own pace. Alexander's campaign moved with a speed and directness that collapsed that buffer, striking toward Babylon, Susa, and ultimately Persepolis itself within a remarkably compressed time frame, giving the eastern satrapies no opportunity to mobilize the kind of overwhelming secondary resistance that Persian depth theoretically still possessed. Even after Gaugamela, the empire did not immediately die. Darius fled eastward toward Bactria and Media, hoping to rally the empire's easternmost satrapies, the very regions whose cavalry and manpower had underpinned Persian military strength since Cyrus's original conquests. Had he succeeded in reorganizing resistance from that base, historians reasonably debate whether the war might have continued for years, given the genuinely vast reserves of the empire's eastern territories. Instead, Darius was betrayed and assassinated by his own satrap, Bessus, in 330 BCE, an act that, in a final grim irony, mirrored the very kind of internal political fragmentation and satrapal overreach that had characterized Achaemenid succession crises for over a century, this time occurring at the precise moment the empire could least afford it. Alexander, upon finding Darius's body, reportedly treated it with royal honors and had it sent for burial with Achaemenid royal rites, a symbolically calculated act positioning himself as Darius's legitimate successor rather than merely his conqueror, completing the transformation of conquest into inherited legitimacy that Cyrus himself had pioneered against Babylon 2 centuries earlier. The wealth Alexander captured across Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, according to later classical sources, was staggering even by the standards of an empire whose treasury had funded entire foreign wars by proxy for the better part of a century. A final testament to just how vast Persia's resource base had remained even in institutional decline. Persepolis itself was burned during Alexander's occupation in 330 BCE, an act ancient sources describe variously as calculated political theater symbolizing the end of Achaemenid power, a drunken impulse during a feast, or retaliation for Xerxes's earlier burning of Athens. Historians remain divided on which explanation, if any single one, best accounts for the decision. What emerges from this three-part history is a portrait of an empire whose durability rested on principles that proved almost invulnerable to conventional warfare, peripheral rebellion, and even sustained multi-generational succession crisis, yet which had never been designed to withstand an opponent willing to reject negotiated settlement entirely, strike directly and repeatedly at the reigning monarch's personal legitimacy, and move faster than the empire's own vast bureaucratic and military machinery could reorganize around a threat to its absolute center. Cyrus built an empire on tolerance, absorption, and administrative genius. Darius I built the infrastructure and institutional checks that let it survive its own infancy. Xerxes and his successors proved it could lose spectacular battles and entire wars of choice without losing its fundamental character. It took Alexander, a commander who, by several ancient accounts, studied Persian history, court politics, and military doctrine before and during his campaign, and who consciously positioned himself as Persia's successor rather than simply its destroyer, to demonstrate that the empire's one true vulnerability had always been time and legitimacy concentrated at a single point rather than dispersed, as Cyrus and Darius had built it, across an entire continent. Across three parts, the story of the Achaemenid Persian Empire reveals something larger than the rise and fall of a single dynasty. Cyrus proved that conquest through tolerance and absorption could build an empire faster and more stably than conquest through terror alone. Darius I proved that administrative architecture, roads, satrapies, checks on regional power, could turn a sprawling patchwork of nations into a durable state. Xerxes and his successors proved that an empire with enough strategic depth could lose entire wars, entire fleets, entire generations of court intrigue, and still remain the dominant power on Earth for 2 more centuries. And Alexander finally proved that even the most resilient system ever built by the ancient world had one point of failure, a single, undivided center that, once struck directly and repeatedly with enough speed to outrun the empire's own capacity to reorganize, could bring the whole structure down. The Persian Empire was almost impossible to defeat, and it took the combined genius of a king who understood exactly why to finally do it.